Damian, Coory, it's been a while. I'm glad to see you. How have you been?
Good, Josh. Good to see you too, mate. Very good to see you. Hope all's been well. I've been pretty well,
Yeah,
given the election drubbing.
I know. So I haven't
Yeah.
had a chance to talk to you about that. Lots of other things have been going on, and I wanted to sort of wait a while till the dust had settled, because usually that's
Yeah.
when things come out and you get a clearer picture. But first off, for our listeners, I just wanted to ask you, basically, you can talk for as long as you want to answer this question, but what was your experience? Because you're not a career politician. This is the first time I assume that you've been involved in running for an office, and I'm just really interested because you have a background in media and you've covered things like this. So what was it like for you going in? What were your expectations? Did your experience meet your expectations? Was there anything that you found difficult? Just in general, for someone who wants to live vicariously through you, what was it like?
Um, I think of better people to vicariously through, but anyway. Um, uh, well, there was two campaigns for me basically because it was my own experience running as a House of Representatives candidate for the seat of Ryan in Brisbane, and then there was my work that I did with the Liberal Democrats more broadly and specifically to help Campbell Newman in his Senate push. Um, and so I guess the biggest shock for me, or the biggest learning for me about the Australian environment, is how much it's changed since the late 90s and 80s when I was a journalist before I went into PR and then moved overseas for 20 years. Um, it's a different game in a lot of ways in this country now, where uh, it doesn't appear to be the news value that's getting the stories up. The first big shock came when we announced Campbell's run for the Senate. And we did that in what you call, like, typically you sort of do this thing called a doorstop, where you invite the media to come to a particular location. They all come to a particular location. You've set up something. It's usually outdoors, so they don't have to set up lights. It's that sort of casual kind of thing. It was a Sunday. It was mid-COVID, so there was a lot of COVID news going on, of course. But we put Campbell out there, and I thought, I mean, for Victorians, this would be the equivalent story of, Jeff Kennett announcing he's running for the Senate. I suppose if you're in New South Wales, I mean, it would be Gladys Berejiklian announcing she's running for the Senate or something with a new party. So it's a big story. He was also the former Lord Mayor of Brisbane for 7 years before he was the Premier of Queensland. So this is not a low-profile politician, to say the least. So I expected, pretty much blanket coverage of this thing. We did the usual press release, did the announcement. I went home, switched on the 6 o'clock news, fully expecting to see it there. And not only, I mean, it wasn't the lead story, and that was because I think there had been some COVID spike in the numbers of that, and they were running with that as the lead story. And then I waited, and it didn't come up in the second story or the third story, or what we call in television the first break of the news, the bit before the first ad break. So I thought, oh well, maybe they pushed it as lead for second break. You typically leave a good story as the lead story for the second break. So the second break came on after the ad break, and nothing. So I just thought, wow, okay. I think there was a small piece in the Courier Mail the next day, and the Australian ran probably the biggest piece, which was still only a small bit. But I mean, why would the Australian necessarily want to run a large piece on it? It's more of a Brisbane or Queensland story, and just to see it not appear like that was quite a shock. And then the rest of the campaign, it was just really, really hard to get Campbell Newman any coverage in Brisbane. It was easier in the regions, and he had a great team of people around him who were able to help him get a lot of coverage in the region. They went on a number of regional tours. He built great relationships out there in Queensland, throughout the state, and that was great. But it just didn't happen in Brisbane. So the difficulty of getting on the media, I wangled a couple of primetime interviews on major radio stations just because of my background in radio and the media and people I know and stuff. But I couldn't just present myself as the Liberal Democrats candidate for the electorate of Ryan. I had to present myself as Damian Coory, former, radio newsreader, talk show host guy who went into PR who is going to give us a broad view of what it's like on the election trail. I had to wrap it up in that kind of a story.
Basically,
just to
what I'm doing here. Basically, what I'm doing here. So sorry about that. But,
I'm wondering how long I can ride on the coattails of that.
But continue, So you feel like you feel like you were spiked by the media.
Oh, the party was definitely spiked by the media, and I think not just the party. I mean, I wrote an email to a couple of old mates who are still very senior in television journalism back from my day, and they're still in the game, and they're good old style reporters, nice guys, good friends. We have probably different politics now, but they both, and they're both high profile. I won't name names, but they, they're well known people, and they both said. I said to them, why aren't you giving minor parties more attention? This is a big election. From the perspective, like the narrative here is there's a groundswell of discontent with the major parties. This is going to be a reaction election. And so, if any election, you would be giving a bit of attention to emerging minor parties like the Liberal Democrats, Clive Palmer's UAP, or Pauline Hanson's One Nation as a more established one. You would think it would be this election, right? Talking about that groundswell of what we thought could have been up to 30%, but it turned out to be about 10% of people who were really, or 10 to 15, that were really fed up with and were conservative and wanted an alternative that was conservative, not the Greens or the Teals. And they wrote back to me and basically said, look, we're giving attention to the Teals. So we are giving attention to minor parties. And I thought, well, that's kind of missing the main story is not really the Teals. It was a big story, but it's not. The main story was the fact that we had a Conservative Prime Minister, what was supposed to be a Conservative Prime Minister, and a Conservative government, or at least, centre-right leaning more. And he wasn't behaving like one. And so that there were all these Conservative parties emerging in a freedom-friendly minor party rise up, if you like, intertwined with the rise of the freedom movement in Victoria and through other states as well, but mainly in Victoria. And I think that's a narrative and a story that the mainstream media missed.
Have you noticed, though, that there are no alternatives? Sorry.
I was just going to say the mainstream media are not well resourced anymore, or as well resourced as they used to be. So there's just going to be this lack of ability to cover a lot of the things that that probably should be covered, and groupthink is strong, and follow the leader on story narratives is strong. So nobody wants to stick their hand up and go, I think we should take a different tack on this story angle tonight. Like, what are you, a weirdo?
Because when I heard about,
stick to the script.
Yeah, exactly. When I heard about the Teals, I thought to myself, well, that's a novelty. I mean, these people aren't professional politicians. These people are at best, they have positions of responsibility. But I found that since the Teals were basically importing a carbon copy of their policies, it's hard to call them independents.
Yeah. So, I mean, let's be realistic about what the Teals were. And I don't want to get sued, and I don't want to say anything too negative, but so I'll be positive about it. I mean, I think what Simon Holmes à Court did, and I wrote a piece on this for The Spectator, I think what he did was excellent in terms of just pure political strategy. It wasn't, in my humble opinion, ethical. But essentially what he did was he decided upon three principles, right, very early on. Well, he decided early on, I think it was the night that he got tossed out of the Liberal Party event in Josh Frydenberg's electorate by Josh Frydenberg, that he decided he was going to take Josh Frydenberg down. And he did in 3 years, which is pretty amazing in Kooyong to do that. So he basically decided then, I think, that there were three big issues for inner city elite Australians. And I don't think this strategy would have worked outside of central Sydney, Melbourne, and Brisbane. We didn't have any Teal candidates in Brisbane. He didn't run them here. And that's why we wound up with three Green. So all of Brisbane's inner city electorates are now Green. So we have the most Green MPs, three Green MPs at federal level out of the four that are in Parliament. The other one's Adam Bant in Melbourne, of course. That's the House of Representatives. There's a few in the Senate, of course. But that little cluster in central Brisbane, and then the cluster of Teals in Melbourne and Sydney, and I think Perth, maybe Adelaide. I'm not 100% sure. I need to research that, but it would appear to me that he kind of had that intention. So, what he did was really marketing 101, and marketing 101 seems to defy, and this might come as a shock to people, but it defies most of the minor parties, and it defies definitely, to a certain extent, the major parties even. The very basics of marketing, go out and find out what people want to buy and give it to them, is what Simon applied, and he simply, cleverly worked out the three big issues for those inner city elites, and they were women's equality and rights in the workplace, or the perceived, ongoing women's issues that we hear endlessly. Number two was the climate change, obviously. Well, it's probably number one, really. And number three was the integrity issue. Okay. So he's taken those three issues of concern that weren't being addressed by the incumbent Liberal Party. So he's basically saying, okay, these are three gaps in the market. If you did like a management consultancy thing and you're looking at all the companies in an industry and you're trying to find the gap, he found it, right? So that's the gap. He's got a small market, probably wouldn't have worked outside of the inner cities, but he's identified that's his target market. He's looked at the gap on what's on offer for them from a marketing business perspective. He's found those three issues. Now, got to set up a party. Ooh, that's a lot of paperwork. It's a lot of hassle. It's a lot of compliance. It's a lot of regulations, a lot of time. He's a busy guy, so he probably thought, and all of this is speculation, let me underscore. I'm making all this up, right? This is just an observer, an educated guess. But he probably thought it's probably easier just to go with backing some independents. So I'll take the capital and revenue that I've got from all these investors, or donors, whatever they are, and I will assign it to these independents who agree to follow these three principles, these three values, these three core messages, right? Now, I have a theory that he might have actually started seeding and planting and promoting, and this is all legitimate. I mean, there's nothing sneaky or nasty or wrong about doing this. It's perfectly okay if you believe it. These are the things he believes. He's got every right to go out there and push them in the media and stuff. And I reckon they did a pretty good job of pushing those three things onto the agenda. So if you look at kind of the ABC coverage, and they may have engaged a PR firm, I have no idea, but who knows? I mean, I would have if I was them. And I had the money. You'd engage a PR firm, you'd get them out there talking to the media every day, putting out press releases, and you'd be promoting and pushing the narratives that support those three ideas, right? So you'd be out, and if you look at the kind of coverage, every time how did they attack and bring down ScoMo? I mean, in my opinion, ScoMo did enough to bring himself down, but they injured him. Every time he was injured, if you look at the coverage on the ABC and other mainstream media, it was always around integrity, women's issues, or climate change, right? So, I don't know if that was how deliberate or strategized that was, but it's not a big stretch to say, well, maybe that's how they did it. They drove that really well. They did a very good job of it. And as I said, it's totally legit. They have every right to do that. The bit that isn't legit is sort of, I think, presenting as independent, and presenting as teal. I mean, those two things were a lie, in my opinion. Presenting as independent when you're really a collective and you really are operating quasi-party-like in the messaging and the structure. Although I'm sure they did nothing illegal, and that's fine. I mean, they've obviously been very careful how they've done that. And it's clever strategy. But that's what they've done. They've presented as independent when, let's be honest, they're not. And secondly, they presented as teal when they're not. Now, the idea of teal is supposed to be a mix of green and blue. So in other words, what they're sort of saying is that this is the party of people who would be in the Liberal Party otherwise, but who don't subscribe or are concerned about the Liberal Party on those three levels. Now, I don't believe that's the kind of independence they backed. I believe that they backed a lot of ideologically left independents, probably more than teal. Certainly people who buy into the inner city elite narratives of, postmodern identity politics and that sort of stuff. So I don't think you'd be getting away from any of that with these guys. So I wouldn't call them teal. I mean, I'd say they're a little red and a bit green, and I
Which
guess you mix
doesn't
that up
make
and
a
it
nice colour.
makes baby poo brown, really, doesn't it?
Quite
But
ironic, really. I mean, I remember the teal candidate for my region, and she just popped out of nowhere. Had a community run about taking photo ops and all those other things, and saying, you know, we care about this, that, and the other thing. And I was asking her questions about her policies, and I got no answer. And so I started asking those questions on her Facebook page, which is a great way to get blocked. And that's what happened. So I found that, at least in my experience, the teals that I tried to communicate with to explain their policies couldn't. And they were just there for faces and for photo ops, basically to fill a seat, I suppose. Whereas that's
yeah, well,
not.
look, I mean, Simon did what they did. The Teals was first class branding. I mean, it was first class. They created a brand out of an organization that didn't exist theoretically. So it was
They
kind of
got
like, you know, this is the image and the brand of the Teals, right? And they were all women of that demographic, you know, that sort of 30 to 55
professionals, usually.
professional women. Yeah, yeah. So they were now to me, that's not a Liberal Party class. That those people shouldn't be in the Liberal Party. That's the inner city woke class.
Yeah.
The rich elite professional women are typically that inner city woke class. A lot of friends in that class, and they're all left wing.
Yeah.
Very few of them are right wing.
Yeah, and I asked them about their views on education. Didn't get any answers back. There was just no communication. It was almost as if, I remember reading Richard Dawkins' book, The God Delusion, and while I was reading it, I was thinking, this is really only going to convince people that already agree with you. It's not really got a lot of meat to it for a Christian like me. And I found that with the teals that I was engaging with, it seemed like they were only really there to lobby together people who already agreed with those three issues and thought that there was nothing else in the world to worry about. And so when I was asking about education, I didn't get anything back from them. They weren't really interested in talking to me, even though I'm one of the voters of their electorate.
That's a really good observation that I think probably, you know, it speaks to the fact that they probably pre-identified, because they pre-identified the issues, they probably pre-identified also that they had enough. The numbers were there. So all you needed to do from that marketing perspective was go out and give people the product, right? I mean, we said that in the Liberal Democrats. I mean, people are crying out for a centre-right party. The Liberals have let them down, right? They want a more conservative approach. They want freedom on the top of the agenda, not at the bottom of the agenda. They want people who are going to speak out against the climate change hysteria, not denying climate change, but at least saying, you know, maybe it's not all man-made, maybe there's a limit to what we can do to fix it, and maybe, you know, destroying ourselves on an energy front and a security front is not a good way to go about it. You know, we were unable to kind of get, I think, a clear package together around that. That side of politics was we were a little too fragmented. And instead of focusing on the things we were united on, the Liberal Democrats in particular is a pretty fragmented, broad church, maybe a little too broad, which is why I'm no longer a member. But it's just important that I think that we look at what they did. And I think what they did was very clearly define what they were and that gap in the market. And you're right. Once you know, there's no need, you know, for Tim Tams to argue why they're better than Oreos. You know, they're there, and that's what people want, and people will buy Tim Tams, right? It's only a negative if I engage with Oreo. I'm only elevating Oreo to my brand level, right, by engaging it. So, you know, they knew what they were going after, and they got it, and it was enough to get them over the line in quite a dramatic way.
So back to
what shocked me about Brizzy though was the Greens, mate, because I didn't think. Yeah, I mean, if you look at the three Greens that got up in Brisbane, so we had the candidate for the electorate of Brisbane was a young fella who wasn't expected to get up. He was just a young supermarket worker. I can't recall his name, but anyway, he's now the member for Brisbane. The member for Griffith, which is sort of the inner woke part of Brisbane, the West End, sort of, which is our equivalent of, you know, Collingwood, Fitzroy, Surrey Hills, in Sydney, Newtown, the traditional sort of green area. So he got in, which was kind of expected, but he was also a young guy, but more of a political operative and a sharper sort of more experienced, I guess. But then the candidate in Ryan in my area, which is a little bit more of a leafy, you know, sort of Kew, South Yarra, I guess, sort of, you know, Neutral Bay kind of area. She was a classic teal, right? So she was a teal from Central Casting, right? And she was running for the Greens. So professional woman of that age, with a high profile in the local community. She's an architect, local architect, Elizabeth Watson Brown. And the reason I ran was because I looked at her and I thought, oh my God, you know, she's going to win. This is a blue ribbon Liberal seat, but she's going to win it. And the incumbent Liberal guy was one of these young Liberals, career politician, seat warmer people, I call them. And I think that's the three definitions, the three things that the Liberal Party's got to clear out for it's ever going to be, you know, strong again. They've got to get rid of young Liberals with a career politician mindset. And they've got to get rid of the seat warmers who've lost many elections and are very happy to sit in opposition, taking big fat paychecks rather than being in government where they'd have to do some work. And believe me, they exist. So, you know, those things are the problem with Liberal Party. Anyway, I just said to this guy who was the incumbent here, mate, you're going to lose. Like, you realise you're going to lose. And he's like, oh, no way. No, he had, and I truly believe he had, wasn't just giving me the line. I truly believe he thought right up until probably 3 weeks out that he was a shoo-in because he had a 6% swing was required. I expected to get about 5, maybe 4%. I was hoping for 4 because that's the cutoff that gets you the funding. You get, a lot of people don't know this, you get $1.90 or is it? No, $2.90. Sorry, it's almost $3 a vote. $2.90 for every vote you get, but not if you get under 4%. So that stops, ostensibly that's to stop all the minor people going, oh, I'll have a crack and get 50 votes and get a few bucks. But really, I think what it is to protect the major parties or make sure that they get well funded. So we only got 2.6%, which that was a bit of a shock. I did expect to lose, but I didn't expect to lose. Sorry, when I say expected to lose, I didn't expect to get more than 5%, but too much. But I did expect to sort of get close to the 5%, and I certainly was hoping to get over 4, because it cost me not doing so. But it was, you know, it was kind of looking back at it. You look at it and go, okay, well, I beat One Nation and I beat Clive Palmer. Right now, Clive has a lot of money, and One Nation has a known brand. And I was pretty much a nobody, really. I had a small media profile in Brisbane before I went overseas 20 years ago, but nobody knows me from a bar of soap here now. I'm running in a green electorate, so there aren't too many people who watch The Other Side or any, or Discernible or your podcast or anything. And you know, so I'm a complete unknown. I'm working with an unknown party brand. That's got a confused brand and hasn't really got a clearly defined sort of values core, and we're really up against it, and I was able to beat the other two freedom friendly minor parties, which was nice. So I sort of take that as a bit of a pat on the back, but it was a shock and it was a bit of a blow that we didn't do more. But it was really the morning of election day. I spent 2 weeks standing in the rain. It rained for 2 weeks solid, doing the pre-polling booth outside a little church here in the suburb of Indooroopilly, and with all the other candidates, right, and the thousands of Greens that supported the Greens, and it was pretty messy. And it was there was a bit of a Green feeling, like, oh wow, you know, the Greens really are going to win this. You know, they could win this. But boy, election morning was a totally different thing. Like we sent out, we had a pretty good bunch of volunteers, and we were able to cover a lot of booths, which for a minor party is unusual. And I think it's why we did as well as we did. But we got a lot of people out, and you know, David, my campaign manager, and I were driving around to all the booths as you do on election day, and talking to everybody, meeting people, doing half an hour at each booth. And every single one we went to, every volunteer said, "Oh my God, it's so green. I didn't realize how green it is." Right. And they weren't just talking about the youth vote. It was right through, and pretty scary stuff. So she ended up getting 30.2% of the primary vote, up from 20 at the last election. So, you know, I don't like being right in this case, but I was right that she was going to romp it in, and that was enough to get her above the Labor guy, who was actually quite a good candidate. I thought he was pretty nice to me on the trail, and that got her. He had 25%, I think, from the previous election, so she surpassed him. Which means then most of his preferences went to her, and that was enough to get her over the. I think the incumbent LNP guy had 37 or 38% in the end, so she was well above, well over. In a primary, he had that primary. So when they did our preferences flowed up to him mainly, and so did the other freedom-friendly minor parties. But it was, I think in the end she had on the two-party preferred about 54% against his 46. So it was a clear win.
Do you think that so the media plays a really big role in just about everything that we do in life? But what you said about the Liberal Democrats getting spiked, and all the news sort of do the hive mind thing or the collusion thing, whatever the reason is for why they keep doing the same stories. There really is no media diversity, really, is there, in Australia anymore?
No. And look, I mean, I don't know that there ever was. There's a terrible fear among TV journalists in particular that they'll miss something, that because you get into trouble when the other channel's got something and you don't have it, right? That's when your boss is going to go, "Why didn't you have that in your story?" And so everyone's terrified about that, to the point where a certain press gallery group in a particular parliament, I won't name which one, but that I worked around, would gather and decide on the soundbite that they were going to use in their story, so that none of them got into trouble. They just agree on what the soundbite was out of any doorstop or interview that they'd done, and they just go with that collectively. Now, it may be that 90% of the time they would have picked the same soundbite anyway. We usually did, because it's pretty obvious usually what the soundbite is out of an interview. But just they felt they needed to sort of protect themselves that extra 10%. God forbid that one of them has a different approach to the story. So there's never anything to really encourage. There's nothing in a mainstream newsroom, encouraging you to take a different angle,
Right,
or take a different tack, or take a different approach. And it's really follow the dominant paradigm. I mean, the broadcast media, even in my day when we had a little bit more money and a little bit more resources, I mean, now it's even worse. But even then, it was like, well, we just don't have time to do the research that primary journalists do, like that an investigative reporter or a newspaper journalist might have time to do, because they're better funded and better resourced. We're really following the news cycle and just trying to keep up with it and understand it. So it's a real chase your tail, everyone's out on the road trying to check what everyone else is doing, make sure they don't miss anything.
yeah.
And so it's a bit of a, we don't have the most sophisticated television news in Australia.
I mean, I don't even know what ratings they get anymore.
It's not anyone's. Hey, sorry.
What sort of ratings do they get? Do they get any good ratings anymore? Are they? I mean, the federal government bailed them out to a certain degree with the deal they did with Facebook.
Yeah, I mean, they consistently. Yeah, that's interesting. I don't know I haven't researched where that's ended up in terms of amount of revenue they're getting out of that, but they essentially, I think, sort of get similar ratings to what they got back then. But yeah, I mean, they don't have the power, the clout, the control, and the focus that they used to have. The nightly news, sort of, Brian Henderson style, or it's that era is a bit, the Walter Cronkite US sort of thing. It's kind of over, and so it's obviously much more fragmented. TV ratings are a mystery. I've spoken to media buyers to try and understand TV ratings. And, when we used to do radio ratings in the day, they'd break it into day parts, and you'd find out sort of how much each half hour, I think it was even 12 minutes sometimes they were down to. But it would tell you, how many people are listening for that 12 minutes. So they're actually not, they're the people actually listening for the 12 minutes. So it's a bit like the difference between a Facebook view and a proper view of more than a couple of minutes on a podcast. Nowadays it's like you get the TV ratings and it's all like, it's the 5 capital cities and they give you the number of viewers in each of those capital cities for a show, and then they rank the shows. So the ranking's probably right. But if I was an advertiser buying on a basis of, certain, because you buy ads based on a cost per 1,000. So the idea being that you're reaching 1,000 people, and you make decisions about where you buy your ads based on cost per 1,000 numbers. I don't think I'd be trusting the cost per 1,000 numbers, because there's nowhere where it says this is the length of viewer time. It's like the project had 300,000 viewers last night in the 5 capital cities. Okay, but how long did they watch for? Were 150,000 of them 4 seconds, or so maybe I need to do more research into the ratings system, but I did try to find it out when we were doing the other side, and we were trying to work out what the comparable advertising rates might be for our podcast. And I spoke to media buyers, and none of them could answer that pretty basic question: what is the average viewing length? So
it's all become a bit of a mystery, really. I mean, I don't
think a lot of kids. Well, my kids don't watch the TV news, I don't think, ever, unless it's on in the background. And
sometimes I switch over and get to the weather, but if that counts as a view, I'm not really interested in what else is on or what the stories are. I mean, even when the Queen died, I didn't tune in to see what, Photoshop they'd done around a photo that they took from 1992 or something. So
I'm pretty sure most people are watching the news on online now.
But that's
it
why
might be
I
that
think
they're watching on Channel 7's website or Channel 9's website. Right? They're still honouring the traditional news brands, the mainstream media brands, because of the heritage of the brand and the loyalty and the credibility of those brands, I guess, that still carries. But they're probably not watching in linear time on the telly.
Yeah, true. And I mean, for me personally, I'm pretty much done with free-to-air TV and news and all that sort of stuff. But I know that you try and stay out a little bit, get away from the news and have your break. I really try. I hate talking about politics. I hate that I have to do this stuff. But it came out after some of the smoke had cleared that ScoMo had some secret ministry appointments, and I got in contact with you and I said, hey, can you talk about this for me? And I did my own research a few nights ago, and I thought to myself, oh great, I've told Damian we should talk about this thing, and really all it is a storm in a teacup.
Yeah, I think so, mate. I think it was, and for this I put my crisis management PR hat on rather than my journo hat. In crisis management, you're supposed to think about all the possible scenarios and then put stuff in place so it's ready to go, so you can act quickly. So from a crisis management perspective, I think all but one of those appointments was valid for a prime minister to kind of want to have a backup, be the backup, right? Now, the question of should he have told the public? I actually wouldn't have, if I was him, I wouldn't have bothered. It's not, I would if I was implementing it, like the point at which you're going to use it, yes. But if you're never going to use it, why would you create a storm in a teacup, which is exactly what we got, right? I mean, so there's the proof in the pudding. That's how they would have covered it, ScoMo's power grab. No, it was ScoMo trying to be a decent.
Hey, I live in Victoria. If you want to talk about power grabs.
Yeah.
I mean, seriously, I was looking. Oh, just 1 second about the press conference where he gave the big long interview. I was listening to the journalists' questions, and I determined that most of the journalists sound either in their late 20s or just past 30. Almost none of the questions showed me that they have any idea of how how the government runs. And the other thing is their questions were very similar to when I talk with some, Marxist on the street about how the government is running. And I just thought to myself, oh my goodness, the news media or the people are annoyed that Scott Morrison didn't say anything because they missed an opportunity to call him a fascist. That's essentially what I think was the big deal.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Oh, for sure. I mean, it's like, I want the simple narrative. Bad guy. Be the bad guy. Play the villain
Yeah.
role in my narrative. Otherwise, I haven't got a villain. If I haven't got a villain, I haven't got a story. Yeah. So, look, I think with that sort of situation, I mean, but just to finish off what I was saying about the actual true nature of it, I mean, I think the unexplainable one was the minister that he wanted to override on some announcement, but I think he said that he made that public anyway, but he didn't make public the fact that
was it got to do with resources, some sort of
yes,
drilling off the coast
to prove something or an overriding of something or a stopping of it. I can't remember what particular project it was, but that was the one that sounded a bit odd. But he said he had his reasons for that, and that was sort of clear to everybody. But so there may be something there, but certainly there's no substantive issue with this, and it is, in my view, I would agree with you. I think it was one of the classic sort of simplistic media narrative that we can make ScoMo look like a bad guy, and Labor ran with it and beat the crap out of it as they usually do, turned it into a great integrity thing, driving that integrity narrative. I mean, I think I tweeted out, guys, you won. Like, it's over. You can stop now. You've got, you don't need to start thinking about the next election just yet. Just get on with it, do something positive, and get focused on being in government instead of opposition. I suppose it takes a while to get out of the habit, but he's not the Prime Minister anymore, so move forward. And it's probably healthy to put some parameters around that for future situations. But I think to criticise a Prime Minister for saying, well, I need to step in if I have to and run this crisis. If it was the crisis that was made out to be, it's like a wartime crisis, then you do have to see a little bit more authoritarian, hierarchical leadership kick in, and he's the Prime Minister, so theoretically he could remove any minister he wanted and replace them with someone anyway. So why the big stink? Now, if there's some administrative thing that needs to be fixed, good, fix it. But it's just another one of these bloody things that Australia media and the political class go on with, and they're not thinking about us. They're not thinking about the real issues like the debt, or the economy, or jobs, or anything, or the problem that we're going to have with energy being expensive and cost of living and inflation and low wages, and how do we get everything moving again? No, that's all too hard. That's actually running the country. We don't want to do that. We'd much rather play these virtue signaling games around simplistic narratives that allow us to look like the good virtuous people, and we can villainize the guy that's on his way out. So it was just an irritating pain, and another one of those irritating narrative news cycles that just like a massive yawn. But I think it shines a light on those issues and probably makes us all a bit more aware of just how stupid things are and how people get caught up in this stuff and carry on about it too much.
Like Albanese went pretty hard on him, talking about our democracy and all this other stuff, and to me it just sounded like card stacking, like the bad guy who I replaced. That's why everything was bad, and he doesn't believe in democracy.
I'm the white knight. Look how clean I am because I'm cleaning up that mess.
Yeah.
Don't look at the mess over here.
But that's the thing. It's like the call out. It's like I'm calling you out, and all our grievances have to be aired in the public. And I think it was a good example of why tabloid works as far as news, and why it's replaced decent, good, objective news, is because there's an attitude that you want to shame people you don't like. You want to vilify people that disagree with you. This is in general. But also the people that are writing the news seem to be thinking in those terms. They don't seem as educated as the news presenters or the news writers from the 90s. Even in the 2000s, you had some people who had cut their teeth in the 80s and 90s and were still in there. Now it seems like everybody is so young that that it really is like a sort of like an extended tweet or an extended Facebook argument, and it feels like that's where the quality is.
Yeah, I wouldn't. I think you're being too nice on my generation, the Gen X journos, and the baby boomer journos. I think we were just as bad. I think the tabloid thing's been around for a long time. I mean, Frontline, the comedy,
Yeah,
is probably the best. The Working Dog show with Rob Sitch and
yeah.
Tom Gleason, and those
I've
guys.
got both the seasons
Get
on
that out.
DVD. It's great stuff.
Yeah, well, go back and watch them because man,
You think
that
that's full
was
on?
it was accurate as anything. There was no exaggeration in any of that, and it's some of the most brilliant satire and critique of a phenomenon ever. Um, and newsrooms in those days were like people shouted and people screamed at each other, and it was like used car salesman stuff, and it was sleazy, and there were a lot of drunk men running newsrooms as news directors. um, and I think it's gotten worse. I don't think it's gotten better. But it was always this manipulative. Like people know. I mean, they knew, right? What they were doing, and you had to kind of do these things to rate. I mean, it's never been anything but, right? I mean, it's always been, God, do we cover this properly and comprehensively, or do I, do a clickbait? Well, we didn't have that term back then, but do a headline. Several headlines were the original clickbait. Do we put a shock headline out there that maybe through omission or generalization or slight distortion, it creates an impression that the story is more sensational than it is and gets people to pay attention. I mean, the New Idea, was doing that in the 1970s. It's like so. And Channel 10 News certainly was when I was there in the 90s. So it's not like it's new. It's just worse, because I think we live in this more that's all been taken on to overdrive by social media and the clickbait phenomenon. And so you got mainstream media competing with that now as well. So getting facts. But I think parallel to that, we're all getting a little bit more savvy. We're all getting a bit more media savvy. And I think that's good. Because I think in the old days it was easier to manipulate the narrative. Might have been easier for the PR people too, rather than nowadays where it's like, the authentic story is going to get out there eventually. It doesn't matter what you do. I mean, you can delay it, but it's not going to disappear in a news cycle. Something will bring it back, or there'll be somewhere that people can find something if they want to go back and look at something or whatever, So I think it's. I'm not as pessimistic about that and I don't necessarily think the world's in a worse place because of social media than it was, because I think it was pretty bad back then and much harder to cut through. Like, I mean, we couldn't have been doing this. We couldn't have had this conversation. And there was some pretty horrible stuff going on down there those days. I mean, I grew up in the Joe Bjelke-Pearson era in Queensland, and, Joe was a great economic conservative classical liberal premier. He certainly got the state moving economically, and he achieved a lot and worked bloody hard. And he was fantastic on that front. But behind the scenes, he had, very corrupt ministers running around doing all sorts of dodgy things. And, and the organized crime was up there, and, it wasn't nice. So that was very hard for people to break through and get that narrative out, because all you had was the Courier Mail, and the Courier Mail wouldn't act because Joe bought all his ads. All the government advertising was a major part of the advertising revenue for the Courier Mail. And Rupert Murdoch set up the Sun newspaper in Queensland, and Joe gave him all the advertising, and to punish the Courier Mail. And then the Courier Mail, had to change its editorial stance to get it back. So there was no way they were going to run anything until Chris Masters, a journalist from Interstate at Four Corners, did the Moonlight State episodes of Four Corners. And they had basically, but I think he worked a lot with the Courier Mail. Phil Dickey, I think was the journalist's name, who wrote the series for the Courier Mail. And then it was only because it was coming out on Four Corners that the Courier Mail ran Phil Dickey's stuff on the front page. So it was kind of, just as bad back then in so many other ways. So look, I think we live in a good time in terms of being able to have these sorts of conversations and people being able to. What shocks me these days is the public, because I think that's what always bugged me when I was a young journo, in my 20s. It was always like, well, we can do this stuff, but the public won't. The public won't listen to it because it requires a bit of cognitive work. So you're only going to get that sort of 10% that actually think and care, that are going to watch stuff like this. But hopefully we have an impact, and we can now, and previously we wouldn't have been able to. So.
Yeah, the analogy that I like to use is there are lots of Hungry Jacks and McDonald's around, and the proper restaurants that serve real food are going under. The general public usually like the easy to palate thing, and the thing is that there's so much sugar in it, metaphorically, that it becomes addictive, so that you can't actually eat outside anymore. I mean, I'm probably mixing too many metaphors, but I mean,
No, I get the point. I think, well, it's a sugar high. Yeah, I mean, there's that attraction. The restaurant analogy probably works if you're thinking about. Because the other dimension of that is that you've seen McDonald's shift its menu significantly, particularly in Australia, to a higher end, more expensive positioning of slightly better quality food, with more options and healthier options. So there's that phenomenon. I don't know if that's happened to the mainstream media because we're around. But
well, maybe you could call it the internet stuff. I just want to ask you. I'm conscious of the time, and I don't want to take too much of your time, but I want to ask this question because we are about worldviews at the Looking Glass, and it is important, and I'm trying to help people to understand about worldviews. But one thing that just boggles my mind is why in Australia is the M word Marxist or the W word woke just seems not. They just seem to not want to say it, not want to address it, not want to call it out. Is it because they don't know about it, or is it because they're too afraid of the backlash?
Who do you mean by they? The media or
so I'm talking about pollies. So people in the Liberal Party, I know some of them know what Marxism is. They know about wokeism. They can see
I think they'll talk about it on Sky News. Why don't they bring it into the mainstream lexicon? Yeah, that's a good thought. I guess because you try to speak in the language that the audience speaks in, and I'm not sure that the audience, until very recently, would understand what you meant by woke.
Yeah.
I remember when we first looked at it, it took me a long time to even understand and work out that was connected. It was through watching your videos on Marxism and understanding what Jordan Peterson was saying around postmodernism, I think he was calling it, and the identity politics phenomena. I mean, it takes a while just to kind of understand what the heck's going on with all that stuff, let alone to see it coming out of a kind of coordinated movement, which I think it is, maybe not, run by one puppeteer standing at the top, but certainly some very influential puppeteers all over the place, numerous ones with slightly different versions of things. And that creates the cultural phenomenon which we're seeing and living in. I think we're going to see, I mean, again, it's the gap at the market ripe for the taking. Mm-hmm. The view appears to be within the Australian Liberal Party that you can't take it yet. You can't seize that gap. And my humble opinion on that, maybe not so humble opinion, is they're wrong. They couldn't be more wrong. And they're wrong, and they've been proven to be wrong. So they're not just wrong, they're wrong and stupid. And
are they wrong and stupid, or are they wrong and misled?
They're wrong and stupid. I mean, it's also a closed shop, right?
So you're saying that
come back to those three things the Liberal Party got to get rid of. They've got to get rid of the young Liberal with the career politician mindset. They've got to get rid of the seat warmers, and they've got to get rid of all career politicians, right?
So they've got to do a lot of firing.
Politics or exit the Liberal Party as a career.
Yeah.
I mean, it should be, the end of your career. Here's your 5 years or 10 years of national service back to the country. Yeah. Or you start, maybe if you're younger, that's fine. You get a shot at it when you're younger. That's great. But this idea that I'm going to go into politics when I'm in my 20s, having had no real world experience outside of the political game or outside of unions or industry associations on the right, or, the Young Liberals or the Young Labor movement or whatever. And I'm going to just be a good soldier, and I'm going to, just work my way up the ranks and be that number that they need me to be in Parliament and take the big fat salary. I mean, that's got to stop. And the parties have to stop because they're not getting the talent through. They're not getting the talent in.
Do you think the talent? There's probably not as much talent for Conservatives because of the way the education system works, and it's so left-leaning in far as universities, especially in Victoria, with Melbourne Uni, RMIT, La Trobe, Deakin. I mean, there's just a lot of woke stuff and woke lecturers and all that sort of stuff there. So maybe it's a supply-side squeeze for the Conservatives. There's not a lot of intellectuals out there that can really run with it. But if there were, would they want to join the Liberal Party?
Well, no. I mean, they join and then they realize that the machine doesn't really welcome them and that people will see them as a threat. And then they'll go and explore something else, because usually if they're highly entrepreneurial or switched on sort of people, they're not going to hang around for a slow bureaucratic machine to move. They'll want to create impact and have change much faster than that. So, look, I think, when you've lost the Queensland election that they should have won, when you then apply the same bland, woke messaging and fearful approach to strategy of, we can't say anything that'll upset the woke, and you go down to 2 seats in Western Australia in a 59-seat parliament. They got 2 seats.
Yeah.
4 Nationals, 53 Labor. And then you lose South Australia, and then you lose the federal election. Wouldn't you, on round 5, wouldn't you start to say, well, hang on, maybe we better change our strategy? We might lose, but we'll lose with our values intact. We'll lose on our feet. And then next time, we might win, right? But now we're in a situation where in Western Australia, the Liberal Party it's over. I mean, how are they going to come back from 2 seats? That's going to take a few election cycles. In Queensland, they're still big. Oh, we don't want to say anything. Oh, we don't want to be too.
Yeah.
It's like it's very weak, and I think there's a lot of seat warmers in the Queensland Parliament. They promised they were going to get rid of them, and they didn't under Chris Apuli. Victoria? Now Victoria. I mean, God. I mean, we're about to lose number 5. It's like, guys, when do you decide that you're going to stand for something? For God's sake, just stand for it. You've got a core base there of 15-20% now. Particularly in Victoria, who will just go, okay, we're with you. Right. So we take that 15, we take that 20%. Forget the inner city electorates. Forget it. You're never going to change those people's minds, and you cannot let the strategic thinking around those electorates affect what you do in the rest of the country, because the rest of the country doesn't think like that. Right? Unfortunately, that elite, that inner city elite, are the bureaucratic class. Now, the bureaucratic class in Australia have got their little hands on the steering wheel. They've got their hands on the steering wheel in government, right? They're the ones running the government departments. They're not going anywhere because their power base depends on a big government party, right? So they've got to have a party that supports big government. But now we've got the added problem of the corporate bureaucracy, right, which is just as bad. So big corporations in cahoots with government to squish small to medium enterprises, right? And they operate the same way, and they think the same way. And so we're getting all this woke stuff driven through giant HR departments in these big corporations. And so people bring, it's like, okay, that's how I've got to think. That's how I've got to vote. It's the right way to think. It's the way to fit in and get ahead at work, whether I'm in government or the private sector now. So, what do? We've got to fight back from that small business, medium-sized business, Australian business, not multinational. We've got to fight back with, working class traditional value Aussies, not the woke Labor. We've got to go and get the normal people who just want to who care about the worker who actually works, and rewarding him instead of rewarding the people who sponge on the social system. That's the people who sponge, not the people who really need the social system. There's a difference. I mean, it's good to have a social system and all that, but But I think there's a lot of blue-collar Australians who get that, and they're tired of going to work to get paid when people are not going to work and getting paid, and there needs to be some reward for going to work and some honour in it. And, I just think I'm optimistic. I think the pendulum's going to swing. I would have hoped that we didn't have to go through as much pain to get it to swing, but we're not far off where Europe is, and boy, is it swinging. I mean, it didn't take long for people to start screaming for the coal-fired power plants to come back, and for nuclear to come back, and nuclear is, it's a pretty obvious answer. It's a lot safer than it used to be. I can't see why we're one of the few countries in the world that bans it, and we're probably the most geographically sound to have it. And it just, you want clean energy. I mean, that's the way to do it, especially with the small thorium reactors, the molten salt reactors.
Yeah.
They're fantastic little things. And the fact that the Greens aren't supporting that, well, it sort of speaks volumes about what the Greens are really about. So, yeah. Did you see our Green City Councillor here in Brisbane?
Yes, I did. The one that said that, if there's a place that's been vacant, you have the right and the obligation to squat in it if you're homeless, because other people's property is really not theirs, it's yours. And I just thought to myself,
you might as well have said it that way, but it was everything but, right?
Exactly.
It was like, this is what you could do, and here's all the sites you need to go to find which properties in inner city Brisbane are not. I'll just to explain for people outside of Brisbane, our city council, our Brisbane City Council, is one of the biggest, the third biggest, I think, municipality in the world. So it's this massive city council. I don't know why. It would be like having basically, Melbourne City Council running to Dandenong, right? It's just huge. So it's half the population of Brisbane. It's like another state government, really. And it's got a massive budget, and it looks after a lot of our transport infrastructure and things like that. And there's a lot of different areas, and this guy's in that sort of Wollongabba West End area, which is the woke sort of area. And so he's the member for the Brisbane ward of the Gabba. And he is Jonathan Sri Ranganathan, his name is, and he's a Green, and he's every bit the Marxist. I mean, he's a full-blown Marxist, this guy, and admits it freely. And he just, he's pushing for a vacancy tax, which is not a unique idea. I mean, it isn't new. It's something that sort of has some merit, maybe in some situations. I can think of a few places in Hong Kong that were left vacant in the commercials that were probably where landlords were being a bit ridiculous. But, to go around and suggest that people break the law and go and squat and we erode property rights, for mums and dads, investors with their the house that they might have in inner city Brisbane that they're renting out, it just or aren't renting out. And if they're not renting it out, they're not renting it out for a reason. I mean, I can't see how anybody could afford not to be renting out. But apparently there are these houses that are vacant. Maybe they're being held by foreign owners. Who knows? But he's basically saying, find out where they are. Here are the websites to help you locate them on the Brisbane City Council thing. Go and find them, and if you were going to squat in them, well, that would be against the law, wouldn't it? But there you go.
Wasn't there also an encouragement to shoplift to subsidise the lack of money that you get given by your doctorate or the uni or whatever?
Yeah, it was my old my old lefty mates from Queensland uni days. This would be the people who run the magazine at Queensland University, Semper Floreat, which has been the university magazine for 50 years. It's a bit of an institution, and it's always been, stupid left and hilarious, perhaps a university magazine should be in some ways. And they did a piece on how to shoplift, right, which in itself is pretty outrageous, and the university should really be saying, hang on a minute. It's Queensland University though, so they won't. But it basically suggested all these ways to shoplift, and you could, how to disguise yourself and how to kind of not look like a shoplifter and get away with it, using all these different techniques. And it said something like, please lean towards Coles and Woolworths and Kmart rather than mum and pop organisations.
Yeah.
But makes it slightly more moral. You're stealing from the poor people who work at those places instead of the small business people. Anyway, Jonathan Sri Ranganathan decided that this would be hilarious to jump on, and so he jumped on it and came out and fully supported. I didn't just half support it. The quotes I think I took off a website coverage of it were just extraordinary. It's like it's 100% ethical and moral to steal from Coles and Woolworths.
Because this is more classical. This is more classic, old school Marxism, but at a street level. So what's happening in Brisbane sounds like this is the uni culture. This is the immature Marxists getting really excited because they've got a bit of power. Whereas what's happening in Victoria with the universities here is that they've got seasoned, educated Marxists who are pushing policy changes. And so we've got education change here. We've got an updated framework for early childhood education, which includes welcome to country requirements and other things like that. And my son's kindergarten, or not my son's, someone else's sons, my friend's sons, just in case they're watching, there is not an Australian flag in the whole place, but all the kids have done Aboriginal hand flags, And for me, I had to talk to them and ask them, can you please not let my Christian son do yoga, spiritual yoga, which is full-on spiritual, cosmic worldview sort of yoga. And I'm like, look, I'm a Christian. I'm bringing up my son, a Christian. He goes to church. It's a big part of his life because his friends are Christian. Please don't teach him Hindu or Buddhist yoga. And I had to fight to get them to stop. They didn't tell us that was going to be part of the curriculum. And that's what it's like for parents down in Victoria. You have the framework is in place. The only thing that's variable in my understanding is to what degree does the teacher in the primary school want to push the gender stuff or the critical race theory stuff, and how much are they going to just sort of sit back on it. So there are different schools in Victoria that some of them are more woke than others, but it's curriculum for everyone.
Yeah. I think this reminds me of the Jordan Peterson interview with Neil Mitchell on 3AW when Neil Mitchell said to him, oh, come on, it's just the uni students, being uni students. And Jordan Peterson said, no, if it was the uni students, that would be fine. It's the lecturers, right? It's now the establishment. The difference between today and the 60s is it's the establishment. Now, from my perspective, that is the difference between the ABC today and what it was. Like, it was Triple J was the lefty kids that we were kept in line. I didn't work at Triple J, but I was a young, slightly left-leaning, crusading journalist in the Joe era in the 80s. And, here I am, and I'm being sort of guided and led to not be so much that way by seasoned journalists, right? So I guess, in some way, what you were saying about the 20-something reporters now and the fact that there's more of them, there always were young ones, but because it's, as I say, there's no money in it, and most people did get out of the game by the time they hit their 30s. But now it's much worse because those kids are not coming from a diverse political viewpoint. They're all coming out of, you're now going to have a degree, right? In the old days, you could get a cadetship in journalism. You didn't have to have a degree, so they could get you before you got brainwashed. Most of these kids are coming out of these universities and going into these newsrooms with a real sense of, I know how the world ought to be working, and it ought to be working like this in this postmodern neo-Marxist paradigm. And so I'm going to do everything to fight for that and, subtly tweak my editorial and writing and everything to that. And there's no grown-ups in the room anymore saying, don't do it, because the people who are still in those roles in those newsrooms are the ones that didn't or chose not to go on an entrepreneurial path, or chose not to go into corporate, or chose not to move on to a different role, or didn't have the capacity or ability to do that, right? So they didn't leave like I did. And I'm not saying that everyone that's my age that's still in there is is there because they usually, I mean, a lot of the ones I know are in there because they were bloody good and they were able to actually get paid decent money and have a career in there. So there's those as well. But there are a lot of people behind the scenes who are still in there that are old hacks and old lefty hacks and things, and they're not interested in steering these kids in a different direction. They're just quite happy to go for it, especially the Triple J crowd at the ABC, because the Triple J crowd at the ABC are now Metro Radio, right? They're now your mainstream 702, 612, announcers on ABC Brisbane, Sydney, Melbourne, Perth, Adelaide. They're not a Triple J anymore. So the kids are running the asylum in more ways than one, and duplicate that through every government bureaucracy, and that's where we're at, right? So you take that into the education department, you take it into the health department. This is what's running our country. These are the people running our country.
And you just said the kids are running the asylum. Have you noticed that younger and younger forums are being created because the Marxists, or in Marxist theology or Marxist theory, they believe that the younger you are or the more native you are, the purer you are. And so your opinion is better. So you have calls for commissions where we want all the primary school grade 6s to come in and give us your opinions about climate change and policy and stuff like that. And this is where I'm getting scared because I don't know how close we are to this, but there was the threat to a referendum to have an Indigenous voice or a parliamentary voice which essentially is making another parliament, essentially making a shadow parliament.
Yeah, it's an advisory chamber, but it's a waste of money because it's another layer of bureaucracy.
You have to pay these people.
I mean, go out and get bloody advice. We know what we've got to do. Just fix the
and also, tell me Lydia Thorpe isn't going to go for that job.
Well, exactly. I mean, this is what it is. I mean, you're not going to see people like conservative. You're not going to see conservative Indigenous people in there.
You're not even going to see. You're not even going to see traditionalists in there, because a lot of the Marxists that are activists. A lot of the Indigenous people who are activists have a Marxist framework around their vocabulary and their categories.
Well, yeah. I mean, all the identity politics, because remember, it's Marxism using
exactly, yeah. And this has been going since like 70s.
Real Aboriginal people in communities, and they're not saying, we want gender equality or we want equality of this or that. They're saying we want to be able to not be raped or attacked, or we want domestic violence to police properly, we want crime policed properly, we want the drugs and alcohol out of our communities so that we can thrive. And so but that doesn't serve the neo-Marxists, right? They've got to keep that perpetual cycle going.
You need to weaponize the victimhood.
Totally
and they give
crucial.
them a victim narrative, and if they accept that victim narrative, they then promote that person to speak in front of public, to make that person a spokesperson for everybody, no matter how much they misrepresent the majority of their people. Yeah, and that's the sad thing.
So, Josh, let me ask you, because I often get confused about this. How do you define? And I'm not a student of Marx, so I'm not that au fait with it. But what is the Marxist dialectic? Is that, when you say dialectic, is that the attempt to create the victim, the oppressed narrative in everything? Is that the dialectic?
What it is it's creating a conflict. So you have a position, a traditional position, and that position then attracts its opposite. And the Marxist wants them to fight because it's in the conflict that they get tired of fighting each other, and they come to some sort of conclusion and some sort of resolution that both the groups are destroyed. So what I was going to do was do a little presentation where I have two balls of plasticine. One is red, one is blue. And I'm going to say, let me show you the Marxist dialectic, and I smack them together and I mix them up, and then you've got a purple ball. It's not exactly the same as red, it's not exactly the same as blue, it's a brand new ball, but both the other two are destroyed. You can never separate those back into red and blue. So that's the Marxist dialectic, a constant progression through history towards the end of the contradiction, the end of the contradictions. And that is the Marxist way of saying when we haven't got any more fighting to do, that's when the utopia comes in, where a classless society happens and there's no conflict. But until then, it's conflict, 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 because you've got to keep destroying and recreating, synthesizing everything. So when Marxists and Christians come together, what you get left with, it's recognizable as a little bit of Christianity and a little bit of Marxism, but it's not either. The original two things are destroyed in the conflict.
And then there's another thing arise. Like you've got the purple ball now.
So now, So now you've got a purple ball and a green ball will come along, because any thesis, any thesis will attract its opposite, like a magnet. And so Hegel came up with this idea basically, and Marx adapted it to talk about the way that the oppression of a group happens, and the way that money creates a contradiction, a dichotomy between rich people and poor people. And those two, they conflict with each other. They need to fight with each other. And so it's in the fighting. So you could call Marxism a religion of conflict.
Yeah.
That's why you have antagonists.
Have to have that.
Yeah.
It has to be that. Yeah,
so that's why they wanted ScoMo to tell everybody publicly that he was going to go for these, because they missed an opportunity to create the conflict. So they tried to create the conflict in the press conference. They were trying to rattle him, trying to create the conflict, trying to get it. So it's not just.
And of course, I should point out the journalists are not doing this consciously, in the sense I'm taking the Marxist dialectic here.
Oh, no.
They're just they're doing journalism, and journalism is all about more drama, and more drama you get out of more conflict. And if the narrative's simple, it carries. You can't have complex narratives in news.
So there's a difference. Yeah, exactly. There's a difference between being antagonistic, so just for the sake of trying to get a rise out of someone to get a story. I mean, you might not like that, but that's not necessarily Marxist. So it's like a rhyming or an echo. So tabloid. Yeah. So Marxists used to do a lot of. They used to do a lot of pamphlets. So they used to letter drop lots of things. So journalism for Marxists is like a big thing. They all want it. And Antonio Gramsci said you need to get the churches, you need to get the schools, you need to get the governments, you need to get the media, you need to get the institutions. And through those institutions, change the culture. So that was the long walk through the institutions of Gramsci, whereas Marx and Lenin had more of a by force, with like Stalinist sort of by force. But they all used the dialectic, the creating conflict between two groups, and that's what I see in the media. But it's also what I see in politics with someone, say, like Lydia Thorpe. They will never miss an opportunity to try and create a conflict or a controversy, to try and churn up everything. They do not like it when everything is going well.
Got it. There you go.
And it's mystical. Their idea of it, it's a mystical thing. Somehow this conflict is like a wheel that churns forward to the end of history. It's a lot of people call it a religion because it is supernatural.
It is. It's cult-like. There's no doubt about it. Yeah.
And that's what I want everybody to understand. Don't join in this conflict or be taken by the propaganda. That's hard to say, but it's people are so into it.
As you said, it's an echo, or like the media is an echo. The media wants conflict for a different reason. They want conflict for the drama that conflict brings and the eyeballs that want to watch the drama, right? I mean, we pay for artificial conflict. We pay for sport is artificial conflict. Movies where, the hero's battling the villain, that's artificial conflict. The Roman Colosseum was artificial conflict. So, that's where that's the root of entertainment, and that's why it aligns so nicely for the Marxists with journalism,
Exactly.
or journalism aligns with it. I got to run, mate.
All right, take care.
Yeah,
Yeah, thanks for talking, and I hope everything goes well with you. And do you think you're going to run again, or are you done with?
We're going to be doing something podcasty soon, so that's definitely happening. I had some good conversations recently, actually, that are looking very positive on that. So we'll have something about the other side coming back, or something similar to the other side podcast coming back. And we'll get you on when we do that, obviously. And politics needs a little bit more thought, but someone came along and wanted me to run, I'd do it, of course, because I care about the country. So
yeah, totally.
you
All right, mate. You take care of yourself, and it's nice to see you. Because you're in Queensland and
You
I'm
too,
in
man.
Victoria, I don't get a chance,
Yeah, exactly. All right, mate. Take care.
See ya.